What if the path to awakening isn't hidden in sacred texts or long retreats, but in the creak of bamboo beneath your feet, the sound of a stone tapping a hollow stalk, or the sudden collapse of a familiar routine? In Zen, transformation often begins not in silence, but in friction, when the intellect fails and raw experience breaks through. These are stories not of quiet meditation, but of monks who burn their fingers to teach the unteachable, of emperors brought to stillness by the sight of a beggar, and of students shaken from certainty by a single strike of a wooden pipe. In each tale, something cracks, and in that cracking, clarity emerges. Let us enter these moments of fierce presence where awakening isn't found, but provoked, where the ordinary becomes the doorway, and where doing, paradoxically, reveals the stillness beneath it all. Kyogen hears the bamboo. A sudden awakening. Snow had begun to fall over the mountain temple, soft and steady, covering the roofs and stone paths with a gentle quiet that seemed to muffle even thought itself. Kyogen walked through the courtyard, his breath a faint cloud in the cold morning air, his feet following a path worn by years of practice. For 15 years he had trained here, chanting, meditating, reading, reflecting. He had consumed every sutra, memorized every koan, yet one question refused to release him. What was my original face before my parents were born? It was no ordinary question. It was a fire that burned through every layer of pretense, every philosophical certainty. A riddle not meant to be solved by intellect, but lived through completely. And Kyogen had lived it, through exhaustion, doubt, and restless determination. Yet still, the gate would not open. That morning, like so many others, he carried a broom through the bamboo grove behind the temple, sweeping the stone path in silence. Snowflakes clung to the wide brim of his hat. The wind whispered through the tall green stalks. Then it happened. A small stone, flicked loose by the bristles of his broom, flew through the air and struck one of the hollow bamboo trunks. Tonk. The sound was clear, full, and final, like a bell that needed no response. And in that instant, Kyogen awoke. The question vanished, not because it had been answered, but because it no longer needed one. There was no intellectual breakthrough, no mystical vision, just a deep, all-encompassing silence rising from within. His breath caught, then softened. He stood unmoving in the snow, the broom slipping from his hand. Laughter welled up, not from joy or humor, but from relief. The burden had dropped. The seeker had disappeared. Only the sound remained. Later, he would tell his teacher, "One note of bamboo, and all my questions vanished. My previous knowledge is like a single hair in the vast sky." And the teacher would simply nod, knowing the sound that struck bamboo had also struck the mind. Not with knowledge, but with direct truth. Not with effort, but with surrender. Kyogen burns. His fingers to teach a disciple years had passed since Kyogen's awakening in the bamboo grove. The monk who once chased truth through books and questions had become a teacher himself, quiet in presence, precise in action. He no longer sought understanding, he embodied it. One crisp morning, a young monk arrived at his quarters, eyes bright with urgency. He bowed deeply, then spoke with the intensity Kyogen recognized from his own youth. "Master," the monk said, "I have practiced diligently. I have studied the sutras, meditated day and night, but still, I am tormented by questions about the mind, about reality, about enlightenment. Please resolve them for me once and for all." Kyogen looked at the monk without judgment. He saw not ignorance, but sincere hunger, and he knew that words would never be enough. He said nothing. Instead, he held up his hand and extended 2 fingers, his index and middle. Then, with deliberate calm, he reached for a nearby candle. The flame danced gently in the still air. Without hesitation, Kyogen placed his fingers directly into the flame. The young monk gasped. The scent of burning flesh filled the room. Smoke curled upward as Kyogen held steady, his gaze fixed, his breath undisturbed. "Master, stop!" the monk cried, rushing forward. "Why would you do such a thing?" Kyogen withdrew his hand slowly. His eyes never left the monk's. "I burned my fingers," he said, "to answer your questions." His voice was quiet, but it landed like thunder. "Understanding," he continued, "cannot be grasped through thoughts alone. When it costs you nothing, questions multiply. But when the price is your very body, your very being, how many questions remain?" The monk stood frozen, the weight of Kyogen's gesture crashing through his mind. What had seemed like a cry for wisdom now felt like a veil, a distraction, a refusal to see directly. In that moment, something fell away. Kyogen did not offer further teaching. There was no need. His burning fingers had spoken more clearly than any philosophy ever could, and the monk left in silence, not with answers, but with a seed of realization planted in the charred space where questions used to live. Master Hyakujo. A day without work is a day without food. The mountain temple where Master Hyakujo lived was cloaked in the soft rhythm of seasons. Mist lingered among pine branches at dawn, birds called across the valley, and the monks rose each morning before the sun to sit in silence, then work with their hands in the gardens, the kitchens, the woods. Though Hyakujo was well into his 80s, he still labored alongside his students, pulling weeds, carrying water, splitting firewood with a practiced rhythm. His body moved more slowly now, but his presence was unwavering, grounded. His weathered hands bore the marks of both meditation and toil. The younger monks, full of reverence and concern, watched their master labor and began to whisper among themselves. "He's too old to work like this," one said. "He has already given so much," and another added, "We should let him rest. It is time for him to be served." One evening, they came to a quiet agreement. Before dawn the next morning, they rose early and hid Hyakujo's tools, the hoe, the rake, the small spade he used to tend the temple garden. Without them, surely he would be forced to rest. That morning, when Hyakujo went to retrieve his tools and found only empty space, he said nothing. Calmly, he returned to his quarters. The monks were pleased. Their plan had worked. The master would finally take a well-earned day of rest. But that evening, when the dinner bell rang, something was missing. Hyakujo's bowl remained untouched. No meal was prepared for him. The others, puzzled, sent a senior student to ask why. "Master," the student said, "your food has not been served." Hyakujo looked at him quietly and replied, "I did not work today, so I do not eat today." The words landed like a gong in the stillness. The next morning, his tools had mysteriously returned to their place. And once again, the old master worked beside his students, not out of duty, but in alignment with a truth deeper than words. A day without work is a day without food. Not as punishment, not as rule, but as harmony. A life of practice inseparable from participation, where labor itself becomes meditation. the monk and the old woman who burned the hut. For 20 years, the monk lived alone in a forest hut, deep in the mountains, far from the noise of the world. Each morning he sat in meditation. Each evening he chanted the sutras. He ate simply, spoke rarely, and prided himself on the discipline he had cultivated. In silence, he believed he was nearing enlightenment. Every day, an old village woman brought him food, rice, root vegetables, small offerings from her garden. She never stayed long, just a respectful bow, a quiet handoff, and then back down the path. But one day, she did not leave right away. "May I ask you something?" she said, her voice like dry leaves in the wind. The monk nodded. "You have practiced here for 20 years. What have you truly realized?" The monk straightened, pleased by the opportunity. He recited phrases from sutras. "All things are empty. Form is no other than emptiness. The Buddha nature pervades everything." The woman listened. Her face grew still. When he finished, she said nothing. Instead, she picked up the bowl of rice she had just offered and threw it to the ground. The bowl shattered. Grains of rice scattered across the cold earth. "Dead words," she said. "Borrowed insights. For 20 years I have fed you, and this is what you offer in return?" Then she turned and walked away. That night the monk could not meditate. Her words echoed through his mind louder than any bell. The next morning she returned, but not with food. In her hand she carried a torch. Alarmed, the monk stepped outside. "What are you doing?" he asked. She looked at him with deep calm. "If your understanding is real, you will not need this hut." Before he could stop her, she touched the flame to the thatched roof. Fire leapt upward. Years of study, of effort, of identity, consumed in minutes. At first, he trembled. Then, something softened. The attachment had burned away with the walls, and in the ashes, something clearer remained. The old woman said nothing. She simply bowed and left him standing in the quiet ruin, finally free of everything that had kept him from seeing. Yamaoka and the bamboo strike. The rain fell steadily on the tiled roof of Master Dokuan's temple, a soft rhythm that wrapped the afternoon in quiet music. Inside the meditation hall, incense drifted through the air. Steam curled from cups of fresh tea. A young man named Yamaoka arrived at the temple that day. Brilliant and ambitious, he had studied Buddhist philosophy with several renowned teachers. Now, in his early 20s, he came not to ask, but to declare. He bowed politely before Master Dokuan, then sat upright and spoke with practiced clarity. "Master," he said, "I have come to understand that all things are empty. The mind, the Buddha, sentient beings, none of them truly exist. There is no realization, no delusion, no sage, no ordinary person. There is nothing to give and nothing to receive." He looked at the master with confidence. His understanding echoed the Heart Sutra, and he believed he had reached the heart of Zen. Dokuan listened without interruption. His face showed no reaction. Then, without a word, he picked up the long bamboo pipe resting beside him and struck Yamaoka sharply across the shoulder. The sound cracked through the room. The pipe fell silent, but Yamaoka did not. His eyes widened. "What did you do that for?" he shouted, clutching his arm. His voice was sharp with shock and unmistakable anger. Dokuan looked directly into him. His voice was calm, precise. "If nothing exists," he asked, "where did that anger come from?" Yamaoka froze. His philosophy collapsed in the space between question and silence. What he thought he had understood was now shaken by the raw reality of his own reaction. The pain was real. So was the fury, and so was the embarrassment. In that single moment, the gap between theory and truth revealed itself. He bowed again, this time not in pride, but humility. The master poured more tea, nothing further was said. The rain outside continued to fall, but something inside Yamaoka had shifted. Not a new answer, just the end of pretending he had one. Emperor Daisho stops his procession to see a dead beggar. The streets of Kyoto were lined with banners and silk. The imperial procession moved like a flowing river of gold and purple, drummers leading, guards flanking, and the emperor himself carried high in a lacquered palanquin, hidden behind curtains of embroidered fabric. Everything had been prepared in advance. The route swept clean, the poor relocated, the city dressed for spectacle. Inside the palanquin sat Emperor Daisho, only 30, but already bearing the weight of an empire. His face showed the stillness expected of royalty, neither joy nor sorrow. He had been taught to remain untouched, elevated, untouchable. And yet, on this day, a gust of wind lifted the curtain beside him. In that brief moment, his gaze fell upon what was not meant to be seen: a narrow alley, a crumbling wall, and the still body of a man lying in shadow. A beggar, thin, lifeless, forgotten. Daisho raised a hand. The entire procession halted. The music stopped. The crowd hushed. He pointed. "There," he said, "I wish to see." His ministers hesitated, horrified. The alley was not on the official route. It had not been beautified for imperial inspection. But no one refused a direct command from the emperor. The palanquin bearers turned, awkward on uneven stone. Daisho stepped down, his ornate sandals touching the dirt of an unprepared street. He approached the body in silence. The beggar was cold. No offerings, no one attending him. He had died where he had fallen, and no one had cared enough to move him. "This man," the emperor said softly, "was one of my people." The chief advisor began to speak about numbers, burdens, responsibility. But Daisho silenced him with a look. "How can I claim to rule this land," he asked, "when death like this goes unseen, uncared for, within sight of my own palace?" He ordered the man to be buried with dignity, and in the weeks that followed, he left the palace in disguise, walking among his people, seeing what he had once been protected from. In time, they would call him Daisho the Compassionate. But his transformation began not in a temple or council hall. It began in an alley, with a body no one else had bothered to see. Awakening is not always found in stillness. Sometimes it strikes like bamboo on bone, burns like fire through shelter, or arrives in the cold presence of a forgotten body. These stories remind us that true insight often waits on the edge of discomfort, in the friction between form and freedom, pride and humility, knowledge and unknowing. Not through escape, but through full engagement with life, we break open, and in that breaking, we awaken.